Welcome, everyone. I'm here today. This is Rebecca Snyder with the Maryland, Delaware, DC Press Association, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our third session in our code switching series. If you missed our previous sessions, you can find them on. You can email me to get recordings. We had the Dart Center talk to us about trauma-informed reporting practices. And next week, we're delighted to have the Maynard Institute talk to us about unconscious bias and how that can show up in your reporting and how you can work through some of those problems. Today, we have a terrific panel. One of our panelists will join us shortly. But in the meantime, we have four amazing women talking about how they develop sources and talk to sources who maybe are not in communities or in situations that they're deeply familiar with, and techniques and sort of practical ways you can get sources to open up to you in to get ethical and accurate stories. So Liz Bowie is our moderator today. She is the education reporter at the Baltimore Banner after spending about 20 years at the Baltimore Sun covering city, county, and state education issues. And we're delighted to have her. I think she's going to have the panel introduce themselves. Um, just a housekeeping note. Please feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat. We will be monitoring that, and there will be an opportunity for questions. So thanks so much. And Liz, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Welcome, everyone, today. I just wanted to say that I'm very excited to be at the Baltimore Banner. I was actually at the Sun for more than 3 decades. So I'm actually older than you think, or Rebecca thinks. But about 20 some years in covering education. Um, and I think I'm going to let Isabel introduce herself first.
Thanks, Liz. I'm Isabel Hughes. I'm the breaking news and public safety reporter at Delaware Online, the news journal. Been at that paper for about 4 years, and I was at 2 different papers in Atlanta for about 3 years prior to moving here. So it's keeping me busy.
And Jackie, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Jackie Jones. I am the Dean of the School of Global Journalism and Communication at Morgan State University here in Baltimore. I am a longtime journalist. I've spent about 40 years in the business between newsrooms and journalism education. I even did a stint at the Evening Sun in Baltimore back in the 80s, and have been dean for about 3 years, but been with the school for 11 years now.
And Maya, do you want to start?
There we go.
You can go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm Maya. I'm the diversity, equity, and inclusion reporter for the Baltimore Sun. I've been here about a year, and I was previously a reporter in Florida, in Miami, and then in Lakeland.
And I think we have Peter Hermann coming in. Okay. Yes, we can, Peter. So do you Peter, can you tell me just 2 more sentences about yourself? Peter is a longtime police reporter who I actually sat next to for a while, or in the same row. And he's now doing incredible work at the Washington Post. I wanted to ask you all to comment on, I think we're looking at how we cover communities that we may not be familiar with. And so a lot of times journalists come into communities to report on something at a time that is not a great time for that community or that family or that individual. And I wondered if you could talk about things that you have done to sort of steps that you can take, or your news organization could take, to build bridges with communities before before you're in a situation where you're just standing on somebody's doorstep, cold, asking them to um, comment on something, or asking them to reveal all kinds of things about themselves that are very personal. I guess I think that, ideally we don't go into those situations without um, first knowing that a little bit about that community. So how can we build bridges to those communities?
I'll take a stab at it. I found that really getting to know the community, but immersing yourself, knowing, just even simple things like where's the best coffee shop, or the restaurant that everybody loves to go to, or uh, the history of the community. Any of those kinds of things you can. There's a lot of stuff you can find by checking out your news organizations archives, but also talking to people in the community, and not just community leaders, but just hanging out. I have my oldest boy is a sports writer, and for many years he covered you know high school preps and that kind of thing. And so he would go and he would hang out, and he would just talk to people, and he would talk to potential sources just to be talking to them. He didn't just call people when he needed a response for a story. And so that's what I tell students all the time, is to know something about the community so that when you have to be there, people are more willing to talk to you because they know that you're not only around when you need something. And I think that's how you really build sources. Introduce yourself. I think that uh, we rely too much on the technology, um, and especially when you're talking to someone older. So if someone sends me a text or an email and says, can I interview you about X's? Who are you? I need to see somebody. I need to have some sort of physical touch, and you know, uh, online chats are fine, but I would rather meet you in person. I'd rather see you around the neighborhood. Know that you really are feeling as if you have some investment in what we do in the community, and that way things begin to open up, because I think, like most sources, some people are going to talk to you because they have an angle, or they have a particular topic that they want to focus on, or a certain angle that they want to drive home. And the only way you're going to get to know the sources and what their angles are. They're not talking to us because they want to necessarily. They're talking to us because they think they should, or we get them in the moment. But in order to have an ongoing relationship, you kind of need to know those things about people. One of the best stories my son, for example, ever got was he knew where the coach hung out, to have beers after work. And, a sort of a crisis popped up with a couple of the star players on the team. And when he wanted to get the coach's reaction, he went to the bar. And the coach was like, "Oh, I can't talk to you." And he said, "Look, I already have the story. I know what happened. I'm just asking you what you told the team when these guys got suspended." And so then he got a good quote, because he said, "Yeah, well, I just told him we all have to stick together, and, that kind of thing." And so he got the story because he was familiar, he knew where to go. And one of the ways he got tipped off to the story was a kid he played pickup basketball with in the community called him up and asked him if he had heard about it, and told him what he knew, which then allowed Tony to kind of go the next step. So I think that what you want is for people to call you and tell you stuff and tip you off before everybody else gets it. You can't do that if you don't spend any time in the community.
To jump off that a little bit too, I think as newsrooms shrink and shrink and shrink, we all want to be very mindful of where we're spending our time, what we're doing with it. And I think we've kind of a lot of times gotten into this mindset of, if I go to a community meeting or a community event, we have to, a story has to come from it, because otherwise I've wasted my time. And I think we forget that going to those community events and going to those civic association meetings and being in these communities and having people see your face, even if they don't produce a story that night, you're meeting people, you are hearing what residents have to say, you're hearing what's going on in these communities, and that is really invaluable for, when inevitably you're in their communities for a breaking event or something else, or you know they see you out at a different time, and they say, hey, I recognize you. I'm going to come to you with this story, like Jackie said, um, he reached out and said, hey, do you know anything about this? And you get the story that way because people recognize your face. So I think just people don't quite understand just how powerful it is for people to physically see you out, and again, even if a story doesn't come from it, that's fine, because you're building that trust, you're building that reputation, and people are, you know hopefully going to start trusting you, or at least recognize you enough to say, okay, we're absolutely not talking to that person.
I think one of the things that we've tried to do at the Banner, because we're really conscious of this, is um, some of our reporters have gone and just worked in a coffee shop for a day in a neighborhood, and tried to and advertised, hey, I'm going to on social media, hey, I'm going to be hanging out at a particular place that day. Come by and say hi. Um, we've also um, invited a lot of people into our newsroom, like particular groups of people, to try to say, we value you, we want your opinions about things, so that they've had some contact with us before we're likely to call them. It could have.
As important as the buildup is, which is what we've been talking a lot about, I think the follow up is just as important. I think in talking to sources, like no matter what you're talking to them about, it's always really good to tack onto the end. Who else should I talk to? Not just for this story, but like in general to get to know this community. Who should I be talking to? Who should I add to my Rolodex? What should I know that I don't know? What stories do you know about that you haven't seen anybody talk about? Like, what do you want to see in the newspaper? Like, what do you think is not covered? And then also, this is the hardest part because we're all so busy all of the time, but like following up with sources, weeks, months past when you use them in a story to say, hey, I know I wrote the story a couple months ago. I was wondering about an update on what happened, or, those kinds of things, because it's one story for us a lot of the times, but it's like their whole lives for these sources. And so reminding them that you do care about them and you do care about the issue that you're reporting on beyond that one byline. They might come to you, even if it's not a follow up on that story you wrote, but they might have heard something in the community, and like you are the person that they trust to talk about their stories or the stories of their friends and their family members. So trying not to just talk to people and then discard them, but really like welcome them into your everyday reporting, which again is hard because we're so pressed for time and resources, but just trying to keep up with people as much as humanly possible. I have found that I've gotten a lot of tips just because I followed up with people a couple months later and they're like, oh, yeah, nothing's happened with that, but have you heard about this? And you get scoops that way, and it works out really well. And you do get to build like genuine connections with people in the community. And I've had really pleasant conversations with people who there wasn't a story involved, and no story came out of it, but I had a really eye-opening conversation that taught me so much in just like 30 minutes.
Um, I find that often people can be reluctant to talk to us when we aren't from their community, or we aren't um, they aren't regular readers of our publications. So, and there's sometimes they think, oh, you're just here to perpetuate a negative stereotype of our community. So I wondered what steps you all have taken in the past when you want to make somebody feel more comfortable, and maybe give them a little more control of the or make them feel as though they have a lot more control over the interview. Um, I would say add that for myself, I have often, um, when it's not a public official, I've said to somebody, look, why don't we just talk? And if you, after the conversation, if you're uncomfortable with something, just tell me and I don't have to use it. If you are feeling uncomfortable, even an hour or two later, call me up and say, I don't want to be in the story. And that I've often found that doing that actually, I get better stuff. And second of all, people generally start feeling more comfortable after you've talked to them for a while, and they don't usually call and say, take me out of the story. But I don't know what other people have tried in the past.
I think a couple of things that I've tried in the past, as you said, just talking to people generally and kind of getting them to relax. Um, Sometimes when people are telling me things that are really way more personal than I think they really intended to put out there, especially when somebody's been killed or there's some sort of disaster or some problem in that respect. I tend to just kind of hold off and go back to them later as I'm writing the story and say, you mentioned this. Um, I don't know that we really need it. Are you sure this is what you want to say? Especially if somebody says something really embarrassing, if they really trash somebody, if they are the parent, let's say, of someone who's a suspect or who committed the crime. Sometimes they're telling things that probably in the long run they don't want out there, or they say something that is like really good gossip and it's hysterically funny when you're telling it to your colleagues in the newsroom, but it shouldn't be out there. You could take a coach, for example, who is frustrated when his team that everybody thought was going to win the championship just completely comes undone. And you ask him what he's going to say to the team afterwards, and he is just complaining and fetching about, these kids are idiots and they don't. Does that really serve the team? Does it serve 14, 15-year-old kids to hear their coach say that about them? And you just have to keep going back and say, so what are you going to say to them? You realize you're on the record, right? Just kind of give them a chance to kind of be more thoughtful about what they want to say. And it's not that you're changing the direction of the story, it's that you're trying to get a better story, a more accurate story. And sometimes people just have to vent before you write down what they say or record what they say.
I think to a certain extent, and it varies, when I'm on scene or something, but trying to explain the difference to somebody between like, hey, this is a conversation between us, or this is an on the record conversation, or on background, or off the record. And I don't need to use those exact terms because they're very journalistic terms. But if I get an idea, like Jackie's saying, that somebody's saying something very personal, or that I probably wouldn't be comfortable being printed if I had said it. Say, hey, try to establish what kind of conversation it is. Um, and I find that goes a long way. And I also have found that asking people the level of their comfortability in terms of using their name it really gets me pretty far. I'm out frequently after homicides in Wilmington. Like those are the communities I'm usually out in. And, I think Wilmington has a higher per capita homicide rate than like Philly, Baltimore, Chicago. So that's a lot of what I'm doing. And a lot of times, people will talk, but they don't want their names used, or they just want a middle name or something like that. And I think that really sets the tone for their comfortability, in terms of being quoted, or am I just gonna summarize what they said, etc.
I think too, if when you have a situation where um, you're looking for sort of comparable issues. I had a student once said, talk about going into a community where there was a lot of resistance to Latinos moving into the area, and people, she was hearing all the different stereotypes from people, and I said, a lot of people have other come from ethnic groups that generations past experienced similar kind of resistance, and talk to them about what it was like when they came to the community, and see if there's some parallels or some major differences. Years ago I went to cover a Columbus Day thing, and this guy talked about his mother coming to the U.S. as a war bride after World War II, and they used to have in a lot of communities this thing called the welcome wagon. I'm a lot older than y'all are, so um, I remember that when you were new to a community, these women would come by and they would have little brochures, and they would sit and have coffee or tea with you and tell you what was going on in the community, where the dry cleaners is, where to get your hair done, all of that kind of stuff. And so this guy's mother is sitting there, and they're giving her the welcome spiel, and then they tell her which days are trash days in the community. And then one of the women says to her, "And we walk our trash out to the curb. We don't throw it out the window." And the woman said, "What?" And because the stereotype was that Italians were dirty and they threw their garbage out the window, and they felt obligated to tell her, And so I told the student, I said, when you talk to somebody who has that kind of experience, and how did you adapt and how did you adjust to that in the community? Do you see any parallels between what you went through and what this new generation of people coming into the community are experiencing, and do you think that there's any common ground you can ever have together? It kind of changes the conversation, and then you get into a real discussion rather than just kind of the gut reaction to the circumstance of the moment.
I think one of the things that gets me the farthest with sources is just being like as open and honest and transparent as possible. Like when you start to get some resistance about, I don't know if I want to talk to a reporter, I don't know if I feel comfortable because of past coverage I've seen, or I just don't feel comfortable talking to like the media. Just being like, well, this is who I am, this is what I cover. These are stories I've done in your community in the past. This is the story I'm working on now. This is who I've talked to so far. This is what I understand about the situation. I want you to help me understand it better. Do you think that you can do that? And a lot of times, like when you present it that way and you present what you've done so far and who you plan to talk to after, they open up a little bit. And then just making it very clear, like, hey, I'm only asking you questions. You have the power to answer me or to not answer me. If there's something I ask and you don't want to go into that, you don't want to touch on that, like you can tell me that you don't want to talk about that. We don't have to talk about things that make you uncomfortable, and I won't push if I'm making you uncomfortable. And maybe after we talk a little bit more, we can circle back or we can just drop it. And I'm going to give you my number and I'm going to give you my email, and you can follow up if you remember something or you want to correct something that you said. Like, I'm available. I want to make sure that I get this as accurate as possible and present you as accurately as possible. And I think just being really open about like the journalistic process helps a lot of people who aren't accustomed to dealing with journalists the way the public officials are feel a little bit more comfortable, because they might not understand how it works and they might think, oh, I'm going to say something, they're going to grab one quote, they're going to run away, and I'm not going to have any power over how I'm represented. And like reminding them that this is an open conversation and we're both human beings, like really helps people feel a little bit more comfortable. And something I've run into a lot lately, in talking to a lot of members of the transgender community, is a lot of them have been hesitant to talk to me because they're like, well, I've seen all this coverage in the New York Times and I don't want to be presented that way. And so breaking down, like, well, here is how the coverage I'm working on is different, and here are the issues I'm looking at, and giving them the power to say, how would you like to be identified? What makes you most comfortable? Like, what identifiers work for you? What doesn't work for you? Like, giving them as much power at every step of the reporting process as possible will often help them open up to you a lot more, instead of feeling like this person just wants to grab something for me and run away and I'm never going to be able to reach them again.
I also just final add to that too. I also try to make it very clear when I am recording, because Delaware is a one party consent state. I could just go up, to somebody and start my recording app, and use whatever they say. But I find that I think I would be uncomfortable. Again, going back to my comfortability. Is would I be uncomfortable if somebody came up to me and didn't tell me they were recording, and I thought I was just having a conversation with them. So being clear about that, I think, also evens the playing field.
And I think even just really quickly on that, like the way you approach people makes such a difference too. Like if you like run up to them with your phone out or like with a notebook, like some people are so put off by that alone. They're like, no, 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 I don't want to talk to you. Whereas if you go up to them and I mean, you make it clear, like, hi, I'm with the Baltimore Sun, like I am a reporter, but like before I start recording, before I start taking a single note, like this is what I'm talking about. Do you feel comfortable talking to me? A lot of times when you run up to people like phone out, like it freaks them out. Obviously, I think I'd be freaked out by it too. So just like taking time to remember that they're meeting you for the first time and they don't know anything about you and they don't have any like realistic reason to trust you until you give them one. Like approaching them like a person makes such a difference.
Peter, did you want to add to that?
I have nothing to add. That was all wonderful, and I agree with all of it. It's in the context of when we're talking about covering some of these breaking stories, it's so difficult to to do that because you're so frenetic and trying to get everything and trying to get it now. And I think that's the biggest challenge is to incorporate everything that people said and try to be very relaxed with people and not rush them. Um, they're seeing you're probably if you're in that situation, you're in a town that's probably been overrun with reporters, and you're probably the 20th or 30th one they've talked to. They don't want to talk to you again. So it can be all very challenging. Trying to be different and knowledgeable enough that people will trust you and open up to you. It's hard.
I wondered if each of you could think of a time when you were in a reporting situation and you really didn't understand what the person was saying to you, either because they were speaking a different, they had their native tongue was a different, their mother tongue was a different language, or they were speaking in a slang that you didn't understand, or there were cultural references you didn't get. Um, how did you handle that without trying to um, feel like you're from outer space?
So I actually had an interesting experience with that. It was soon after I actually, it was the first day I started at the News Journal. There was a homicide in Wilmington. It was the middle of the afternoon, and by the time I arrived, there was already a sheet over the body. So I didn't see the race of the victim. But a young man and a young woman come running up, while I'm on scene, and they're hugging each other and they're crying. And they were black, and one, I think the black man was saying, "That's my brother. That's my brother." So I put in the story, because he was saying, "That is my brother." I put in the story that day that it was this person's brother, and I think a reader or somebody, it was my coworker, got an email, because I think it was a double byline, saying, "Hey, that guy doesn't have any brothers. Like, the victim doesn't have any brothers." And after some back and forth, we I learned that it was, slang. It was, like it was street speak. It was not his, blood brother. It was, his good friend. And the victim was white, and these two people were black. And I think that was very eye opening for me. And we obviously updated the story online, and I don't think it had ran in print, so we didn't have to run a correction. But it was something that was very like, I just took it at face value and it didn't even cross my mind that he was talking about, possibly talking in slang. So I've been very careful ever since then to clarify, are you related by blood, or is it, a close family friend? Like what is the relationship there? And unfortunately it took me getting it wrong to figure that out, but it was, like I said, a very important learning experience for me.
So I had a similar, very experience. I covered the Middle East for a while for the Baltimore Suns, and I learned very quickly that, especially with Palestinian community, getting the number of children that a couple had was nearly impossible. Um, some would only answer about the adult, would only count the children, but not those that have turned into adults. And others would only mention the boys, but not the girls. So if you ask a couple, how many children do you have? They say four, meaning four boys, but not count the girls. So it was always a 10 to 15-minute exercise between translators and you to figure out how many children. Very simple question was a negotiation process almost every single time.
I spent a long time in one school, um, and sometimes I really couldn't understand exactly a reference to something, or I literally couldn't understand the what they were speaking about. And after a while, I just wouldn't respond. I mean, I didn't question each sentence. What I did was try to ask later, really delve into, look, I'm not, I'm a white woman, and I need to understand what you're talking about and what you're referencing. And can you explain it to me? And as dumb as I sounded, I think it actually helped, because people respected the fact that I was acknowledging I had no idea what was going on there. And they were happy to explain. And it sometimes got into hilarious conversations too, um, which brought us closer together. Um, so I think, like, total honesty is your best policy, just to acknowledge you don't understand at all. Um, and as Peter said, you just have to, and Isabel said, sometimes you make terrible blunders if you assume something. Um, we've all done it. Me too.
Yeah, I guess the time that I really struggled was I covered the high rise collapse in Sunrise, I guess like 2 years ago now. And obviously the whole week that I was there was incredibly painful and difficult, getting people to talk to us. But there was this one instance that I can still really remember where there was this wall where there were all of these pictures of the missing people that they were trying to locate, because it was a search and rescue operation for like 4 days. And so there was so many unanswered questions. And so people would go to the wall and they would leave flowers and they would pray, and then when they would walk away from the wall, we would try to, as sensitively as possible, talk to people about, who they'd gone and left flowers for. And there was this one woman, and once somebody started talking, a lot of like reporters would kind of crowd around, because it was rare that somebody would stop and talk. And so it almost get like mobbed. So now you're trying to talk to somebody, and all these people are coming up behind you and like almost shouting things. It was a very uncomfortable experience. But there was this one woman who was speaking to reporters, seemed open to speaking to reporters. She had very heavy like Russian accent, And so it was difficult to understand her. It was difficult to hear her. And she was talking very fast. And as she was talking, she was crying. And so now she had a very heavy accent. Her voice was muffled. She was crying. And so it was very difficult to hear what she was trying to say. And I couldn't quite make out like the person that she'd left the flowers for, like what her connection was. Because some people it was family, some people it was just like they knew them. I think for her it ended up being like a long time like doctor that their whole family had gone to. And so I'm trying to understand like the connection to her, the spelling of the name, because we didn't have like a database of these people, so we had to get spellings from people who were visiting their pictures. And I just remember like the longer the conversation went on, like my heart sinking and sinking and sinking because she's crying, she's devastated, it's an awful situation. And I kept asking her to repeat information because I couldn't hear her and I couldn't understand her. And like I didn't want to interrupt her like long, talks about this person and what they meant to them and like all of these stories because she was grieving. But like also I couldn't run anything in the story if I couldn't understand what she was saying and like make sure I had details correct. And so I just felt so awful asking her to continue to repeat things when she was like obviously distressed and telling the story. And so it was just like this balancing act of you want this to be accurate, you want to be able to include this, she feels comfortable talking to you, but you don't want to have to keep interrupting her to be like, wait, what did you say? How old did you say that person was? And it was just a really, really difficult like reporting experience, like overall.
Mm.
Rebecca, did you want to bring in questions now, or should I keep?
Well, actually, I was being mindful of time. That's usually my job here. So I did want to reach out to our participants and see if there were any burning questions. We have probably about 5 more minutes or so before we have to wrap up. Are there, while people are formulating their questions, one of the things that really struck me is kind of how each of you were able to get over that embarrassment or that um, feeling of awkwardness when you didn't know and felt like you had to go back and ask or clarify. And do you have tips on kind of getting over that hump? Do you just do it?
You kind
I
of
think
don't have
people
any choice.
appreciate it when you come back to them,
Hmm.
and you want to check, you want to make sure everything is accurate, down to the spelling of their names. And I can't tell you how many times I've done that and realized that I'm missing a letter somewhere in the name, and feel so good that you went back. And I think people appreciate that it's not just a hit and run interview. You are responding to them and want to make sure it's accurate.
Hmm.
There's nothing worse than having to explain to your editor how you got it wrong. That is like the
No,
longest walk ever going down the hall to the office when you get
I
an
was going to
email
say,
that says, come see me.
I think it's a lot easier to be embarrassed in front of one person than like thousands
Hmm.
when you have to get something wrong.
no, I've had many people come back and just say they appreciate the professionalism of wanting to make sure it's right.
Yeah. So we have a question from Charmaine who asks, is sharing personal stories out of the question? And Jackie, earlier you were talking about if someone was sharing something super personal, you sort of walked it back a little bit to give them time to reflect. But where's that line? Those stories really make the story sing, but you don't want to trot out someone's business in a way that they didn't imagine was going to happen.
Yeah. I think that, it becomes a judgment call over time, but I also think that a little bit of that might be okay because it gets the person to relax a little bit and know that they're not alone in how they feel. But you got to avoid just getting so deep into a conversation that you're just sitting there swapping stories, and then it becomes more about as much about your experience as it is the person you're interviewing. So you got to be real careful in just trying to figure out that balance with how much of my empathy or understanding of your situation is versus just going overboard and really just kind of taking it in a whole different direction, because then all of a sudden your perspective begins to creep into the story more because you're telling the story the way you think you would have experienced it, and it becomes more you than the subject.
Hmm.
I think explaining context to people is also very useful in terms of this is what you said, this is how we would like to use it, and this is why. Because this, here's a story we're trying to tell, and this anecdote, while very personal to you, really illustrates sort of the point that we think you are trying to get across. And a lot of times they understand it because those stories that you elicit from them are based on questions that you are asking that sort of fit the theme of the story. And I think once they understand that that's why you would like to use it, personal or not, this will illustrate in the best way what you want to say.
That makes sense. We have another question, this time from Sophia, and this deals more with people's privacy. So, how do you assure folks that their name won't be shared? Because people are so risk averse, especially with social media. So, how have you all kind of contended with that?
What do you mean by shared? Uh,
Sophia, do you want to chime in? I'm assuming that share their name is like their name won't be in the story.
oh, I see.
We don't we use names, so it's very rare that we're going to use an anonymous source. And I mean, we don't use the names of victims of crimes as a rule, but um, if you're not on the record, I move on. Sorry.
Yeah, similar for us is we use names as much as possible, and if we aren't using somebody's name, we're it's very, very rare that we will direct quote them. I can say, and I'll explain to them, hey, do you mind if I say one resident who lives nearby said they saw a black car drive by earlier in the day. But if they give me an actual quote and don't want to use their name, you know, there have been times it's a really good quote and I've tried to sneak it into the story and my editor's like, nope, I'm sorry, I'm cutting that. So it's a matter of explaining if they're not comfortable with having their name published. We're only going to use you to a certain extent, but also explaining how to
Yeah.
how we're going to identify them as a resident or a community member, that kind of thing.
A lot of
You might allow it if it was a living victim of a crime who has legitimate safety concerns. But we also want to make sure that their story is backed up by police account or a court record or other people or other witnesses. But the bar is quite high.
I think a lot of times for newspapers or online, it's pretty um, easy to maybe identify somebody by name unless your name is particularly distinctive. Um, it, it is more difficult for somebody to identify you specifically unless they know you and they know the circumstance. Where I've run into problems, we had a story years ago about a young girl who had been sexually assaulted. And because she was a minor, we weren't using her name in the story. And then the father agrees to be interviewed, and there he is on camera talking about what happened to his daughter and referring to her as damaged goods and all of that. And I just about lost it when I saw that. I said, people recognize this guy. They're going to see him. They're going to, neighbors are going to look and say, oh, isn't that so and so's dad down the street? I mean, you got to be careful in those kind of instances and decide whether or not that really is worth it, or do you show the father's face? Maybe you show the back of his head or you show the middle of his chest or something, but you've got to think through in those kind of instances what you reveal and what kind of impact it's going to be, especially if the victim's a survivor.
Mm.
I found that a lot of times, and mind you, I don't cover a lot of crime, and so I would defer to all the wonderful crime reporters here about what they shared. But I found that a lot of times people are like, please don't share my name. It really isn't that they don't want you to share their name, it's an anxiety about something else that they've shared throughout the conversation. So, a lot of things that we talked about earlier in this panel about what they feel comfortable sharing, anecdotes they might share off the cuff, and like clarifying details. A lot of times the issue with the name is they're like, well, I just don't want you to say that I said XYZ. And like 9 times out of 10, it is not something I was going to use anyway. So a lot of times it's about, I don't want you to identify this that I said or like this conversation. And once you like walk them through, like, oh, well, like that's not even a problem, and like share with them a little bit more about the story, they like relax about using their name. It's the anxiety is usually misplaced. And so they jump to wanting to be anonymous when the actual problem is like something that's much easier to solve.
It sounds like sort of giving control back to the source and in as many ways as possible, and being really clear and upfront about how you're going to use the information and what your goals are kind of critical, to making sure it goes well. Um, I think that's all the time for questions that we have. So, Liz, did you want to finalize or make any final remarks before we let everyone get back to their deadlines and their day?
Um, I don't think so. I really appreciate everybody on the panel taking my questions and running with them. And I hope we've been some help to the other journalists who've been listening.
Absolutely. Well, and thank each of you for coming out today. I do want to remind you that next Tuesday we'll be here online talking about unconscious bias. And I'm super excited that Martin Reynolds of the Maynard Institute for Journalism will be doing an overview of their Fault Lines program, which really examines unconscious bias and how it can affect your reporting. We'll send the recording of this session out to you all, along with links to our previous sessions, which were from the Dart Center, specifically about interviewing sources who have undergone trauma and best practices for reporting on traumatized communities. So thank you all so much for being with us today, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Good
Thanks,
seeing
Deborah.
you, Liz.
Good seeing
Thank you. Good seeing you, Liz.